مساء النور، أهلا وسهلا بكم. سنتابع معكم من ينضم إلينا الآن. في انتظار انضمامكم إلى هذا الويبينار، أهلا وسهلا. ممكن تحطوا في الشات البلد المؤسسة اللي أنتم تشتغلوا معها. مساء الخير محمد. أهلا وسهلا بك محمد من المغرب. أهلا وسهلا دينا من أخبار متر من مصر. أهلا بكم جميعا من دول مختلفة. أهلا بك جوهر من اليمن. بمعنى أيضا من أوغندا، من سوريا، المغرب مرة أخرى، اليمن أهلا وسهلا، من فلسطين، من سوريا، الأردن، اليمن، العراق، البحرين. أهلا وسهلا بكم جميعا. سعداء بأن تكونوا معنا في هذا الويبينار. نرحب بكم إذا في هذا الويبينار حول تدقيق المعلومات في إفريقيا. إذا ينضم إلينا الزملاء من بلدان عديدة. أهلا وسهلا بكم. البحرين، السودان، لبنان. في انتظار انضمامكم من مختلف الدول العربية ومن العالم لكل المهتمين بالنقاش اليوم حول تحديات وفرص تدقيق المعلومات في إفريقيا. نرحب بكم إذن في الويبينار الخامس ضمن مشروع دليل من الشبكة العربية لمدققي المعلومات AFCN من أريج. هذا المشروع بدعم من الاتحاد الأوروبي وبالتعاون ما بين مؤسستي سايرن وجوسا تحت عنوان كما قلنا تدقيق المعلومات في إفريقيا، التحديات والفرص. يسعدني أن نستضيف اليوم وأن نتحدث إلى كايلي كليفورد، وهي نائبة رئيس التحرير في أفريقيا تشيك. وقبل أن نتعمق أكثر ربما في النقاش حول الفرص والتحديات أمام تدقيق المعلومات في إفريقيا، أريد أن أرحب بكم مرة أخرى. يمكنكم متابعتنا عبر تطبيق زوم ولكن أيضا عن طريق الفيسبوك، ونرجو أن تكونوا كثيرين اليوم للنقاش ولطرح الأسئلة على ضيفتنا. كايلي، أهلا وسهلا بك في هذا الويبينار. سعداء في أن تكوني معنا، وأريد أن أسألك بداية، نحن نتحدث عن تدقيق المعلومات في إفريقيا، فهل يمكن أن تقدمي لنا بعض المعلومات عن أفريقيا تشيك وهي رائدة في هذا المجال في القارة الإفريقية؟
Ahlan, everyone. Thank you so much, Ara, for that lovely introduction, and to Saja and team as well for inviting me to share more about Africa Check and the work that we do. I'm Kaylee Clifford. I'm the Deputy Chief Editor at Africa Check. Before this, I occupied a research role within the organization. So fact-checking is what I know. It's what I was trained on. But as you'll hear from my presentation, fact-checking is not all that we do. And so I always enjoy sharing more about the other projects that we have embarked upon. And I'm also particularly excited about getting to speak to members of a fellow fact-checking network. As some of you may know, Africa Check has its own network, and we see this as being really crucial to building the practice of fact-checking on the continent. So I'm looking forward to sharing more, but I'm also looking forward to hearing from you all about what this looks like in the Arab region. We are big fans of AFCN, and I think there's so much that we can learn from one another. I am going to share my screen. I do have some slides to share.
شكرا لك كايلي. في الوقت الذي تشاركين فيه الشاشة الزميلة فاطمة إذا تقدم لكم معلومات حول كايلي كليفورد. يمكنكم الاطلاع أكثر على سيرتها الذاتية على الشات، ويمكنكم وضع الأسئلة في خانة Q&A. والآن كلنا أذان صاغية كايلي. يمكنكم أيضاً الاستماع إلى ما ستقدمه كايلي باللغة العربية عبر اختيار تفعيل ذلك في خيار الترجمة. ونحن في انتظار أن تشارك معنا كايلي العرض اليوم، وستبدأ بتقديم منصة أفريكا تشيك كما قلنا الرائدة في إفريقيا في تدقيق المعلومات طبعاً. أيضاً كما قلت يمكنكم طرح الأسئلة مباشرة إلى كايلي في خانة Q&A أو في الشات. أنا سأتابع الأسئلة خلال الجلسة وسأقدمها إلى كايلي.
Okay, I think that I have now shared the correct screen. If you can give me an indication as to whether...
Yes.
Okay. Great. Okay, thank you. So the focus of my presentation today is opportunities and challenges of fact-checking in Africa Check. Last year, we celebrated our 10th birthday, and over the years, we have learned a number of lessons. We've had to overcome many challenges, and there are still more that we face. And so in many ways, it feels like our journey is just beginning, which means there is room to grow, and there are also opportunities to take advantage of. So to kick us off, I want to briefly introduce you to Africa Check. We are the continent's first independent fact-checking organization. Our first office opened in Johannesburg in 2012 with just 2 staff members. And since then, we have opened offices in Dakar, Lagos, and Nairobi, and we have a staff of over 50. Our main mission is to verify the accuracy of claims made in the public domain. So these could be claims made by public figures, organizations, and the media, or claims that are shared on social media. We do this by using journalistic skills and evidence that we obtain from publicly available data. So this is what our traditional fact-checking reports look like. Every report that we produce is different, but we ensure that we fact-check all claims fairly and to the same standard. So the process that we follow is always the same, and this ensures that our findings can be replicated and verified. We also follow standards for picking what claims to fact check. This decision is often influenced by a number of factors, including who made the claim, where, and how far the claim has spread. Another thing that we consider is potential harm. So in other words, if a claim was left unchecked, what harm might that cause? We do also accept reader suggestions, and currently between 1/4 and 1/3 of all the claims that we fact check are sent to us by our readers. We think that this is an important way to involve our audience in the fact-checking process, and we use what they send to us to guide our direction. But we don't just publish fact-checking reports, we also publish fact sheets, which cover a wide range of topics. These are great for proactively tackling a topic instead of following what's in the news. So fact sheets for us have become a key part of what we refer to as pre-bunking. And you'll hear me refer to this concept throughout my presentation. But when it comes to fact sheets, it's this idea that there is merit in providing people with facts, even before they are confronted with mis or disinformation. And this makes it all the more likely that they will recognize something as false before it spreads and before it has the opportunity to do any harm. For this reason, we often compile fact sheets on key topics that are important to our readers, particularly if it's something that there is a lot of confusion or misunderstanding around. Similar to fact sheets are our guides. These are aimed at journalists or the general public, and they take a more instructional approach. For example, one of our most popular guides takes readers through the steps of conducting a reverse image search, not just on a PC, but on a mobile phone as well. Again, this is key to pre-bunking. If people know how to do things like conduct a reverse image search, they are better equipped to spot images that have been digitally manipulated or taken out of context before they have an opportunity to do any harm. We also publish shorter blog pieces on issues related to fact-checking, and these allow us to comment more informally on aspects of the work that we do, as well as showcase certain projects. Many of you will know that sometimes a claim does not have an obvious verdict, so it's neither correct or incorrect, but somewhere in between. And in this case, publishing a blog allows us to share what we do know with readers and still encourage accuracy in public debate. Lastly, we also fact-check claims that go viral on social media. As I'm sure some of you are, Africa Check is part of Meta's third-party fact-checking program, which means that we have access to posts that have been marked as potentially false by either Meta's algorithm or regular Facebook users. We currently fact-check between 80 and 100 of these claims a month, and the project has resulted in the labeling of millions of posts so users can see when claims shared on their Facebook timelines are false. But as I mentioned earlier, fact-checking is not all that we do. Part of this presentation is about opportunities for fact-checking in Africa, and this is one of our key organizational goals. How do we grow the practice of fact-checking across Africa, and how do we create opportunities for others in this space? Well, we do this by supporting up-and-coming fact-checking organizations through the Africa Facts network of fact-checkers. We offer fact-checking and verification training for journalists, students, corporates, civil society organizations, and schools. We have launched media literacy projects that are used to create awareness about the dangers of mis and disinformation and how to address it. And then we run an annual African Fact-Checking Awards, which is open to fact-checkers, journalists, and students. I want to spend a bit of time talking about each of these initiatives because it highlights just how much more opportunity there is for fact-checking in Africa and how much room we have to grow. And of course, some of the lessons that we have learned along the way, you may also find useful in your work. So sometimes when I tell people about Africa Check's different country offices, they ask me if we will ever expand our operations and open more country offices. And the answer to that is no. For Africa Check, the goal has never been to run or manage a fact-checking office in every country on the continent. Rather, we feel that where we can add value is by connecting fact-checking organizations and initiatives and providing a space for them to share experiences and collaborate to fight the spread of false information. And so, in 2017, we established the Africa Facts Network. At the time, it had just 2 member organizations. And in a video that I recorded to promote this webinar, I said that today it has over 40. So I've fact-checked myself and I want to publicly correct the record. The number is actually over 50. And I think that this increase really reflects the increasing need for robust and reliable fact-checking on the continent. So to put this into perspective, in 2012, there were just 4 people on the continent doing this kind of work. Some of you may recognize the gentleman on the right as Peter Cunliffe-Jones, the founder of Africa Check. And this was last year at the Africa Fact Summit in Nairobi, Kenya. So as you can see, this is a much larger group. So what does the network actually do, and how is it supporting members? In order to build and strengthen this community of non-partisan fact-checkers, Africa Check hosts an annual in-person gathering. We send out regular newsletters and we organize regular online meetings. This is done with the aim of creating opportunities to share tools and best practices, because we feel that connecting with colleagues in other countries is really a key mechanism for staying current with innovations. And the network has helped to bring together fact-checking organizations across the continent and build a community of like-minded colleagues who can then share knowledge and best practices that are relevant to the African context. The second benefit relates to contacts and sources, because good relationships and authoritative, trustworthy sources and partners who can help verify claims are crucial to a fact-checking organization's success. We found that Africa Facts members really value the contacts and the sources that the network has provided. It's allowed them to do things like collaborate across borders on important topics like the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think drawing on the work of others in this way really reduces duplication, but it also reinforces the credibility and the impact of fact-checking. Third, ongoing sorry, I think I've skipped one. So the network also offers ongoing training, which helps teams keep up to date with new developments and trends related to false information and how it spreads. Many fact-checking organizations on the continent are quite small. They are lean and they have just a small team of staff, often supported by volunteers or consultants. And they have said that ongoing training is important. However, they are working with limited time and internal capacity. And that means that training often takes place on the job. In this sense, the Africa Facts Network, providing ongoing skills development and training, it provides opportunities for members to build expertise and capacity within their teams, while also learning from peers in other countries. And lastly, fact-checking organizations, we know, work very hard to convey to their audiences that they are non-partisan and that they are independent, both from an editorial point of view, but also a financial point of view. And this is important in order for them to build trust. And so the network has provided guidance on things like how to get funding, how to negotiate with funders while maintaining your independence and your neutrality, as well as how to draft proposals. But we don't have to stop there. There are opportunities to do more. And looking ahead, we would like to continue encouraging the establishment of a fact-checking organization in every country on the continent, wherever this is possible to do so. And I say this because we all know fact-checking can be difficult in certain contexts. We're very fortunate in the sense that in the countries we operate in, we can carry out fact-checking activities with minimal risk. But this is not the case in other African countries. So expanding the network will mean also considering how we can support members in countries where media freedom is restricted. We should also explore more ways to connect organizations for knowledge exchange. beyond just an annual meeting or a few virtual meetings a year. It would also be good to help members cultivate collaborations and partnerships with other media organizations, and also guide them through the process of becoming signatories of the International Fact-Checking Network. We have heard from other organizations that this can be a long and difficult process, but we think it's important that fact-checking organizations commit themselves to upholding the highest standards, including on transparency and independence. And then there are also opportunities to continue to highlight and share members' work, experiment with different platforms, and explore strategies to engage young people. Africa has a very young population. 70% of sub-Saharan Africa is under the age of 30. And so if our work is to be effective, we really need to collaborate on strategies to involve this demographic. Outside of the Africa Facts Network, we also offer fact-checking and verification training. And this equips participants with theoretical knowledge and practical skills that they need to stop the spread of false information. So in these trainings, we show participants everything from how to spot false information and verify the origins of images and videos that have been shared on social media, to finding accurate data online. We have trained more than 10,000 individuals over the years, from media organizations, nonprofits, government organizations, the corporate sector, and just the general public across Africa. Even with training and supporting other fact-checking organizations across the continent, we know that we are not reaching everyone. Misinformation is a risk to everyone. It can harm health, life choices, even democracies. But the essential skills that you need to identify it are not really taught. And so our media literacy work is an effort to address this gap. We think that this is where we will see the best potential returns. What do I mean by this? Well, when you write a fact check, you are responding to false information that is already circulating. And there is no guarantee that your fact check is reaching the same people who saw the original misinformation. This is just for fact checks that you are able to publish. So what about the misinformation that you don't have the resources to tackle? What about the misinformation that you don't know is circulating because you haven't seen it yet? A more sustainable and effective approach may lie in media literacy. So providing the broader public with the skills they need to verify information before it goes viral. I also think that media literacy enjoys more buy-in from key stakeholders, because fact-checking can sometimes be divisive. Not everyone agrees with our methods, and they may not want to endorse our findings. This is especially the case when it comes to organizations or governments and entities that we have fact-checked before. But media literacy is something that more people can get behind. It's not necessarily controversial. It's simply providing people with skills across a broad range of misinformation topics. And we are seeing governments pay more attention to solutions like media literacy. So for example, the Nigerian government, through its Ministry of Information, is seeking to address the challenge of false information through a national campaign against fake news and misinformation. This is a nationwide advocacy campaign, and it's something that, as a fact-checking organization operating in that country, there is opportunity for us to add value to, whether that be through advice, content, or outreach, without stepping on any toes, so to speak. Another way in which media literacy complements the work of fact-checking is that it allows for a more participatory approach. So with fact-checking, you may have a group of researchers sitting in an office looking into very specific claims, which you then publish on your website. But our efforts cannot end there. In our experience, collaborating with partners on the creation and dissemination of media literacy content, such as on radio, allows us to engage audiences we might not otherwise have access to and deepen their understanding on key topics. I will come back to this a bit later on in the presentation, but the last point that I want to make here is about how media literacy provides evergreen content. A fact check may address a specific false claim, and it may attract some media attention, and it may even circulate widely on social media. But as the news cycle moves on and time passes, people may lose interest in it. In this way, a fact check tends to have a short shelf life. Before long, it becomes old news unless it is updated in some way. But media literacy content, on the other hand, can be repurposed for future projects. We have had a lot of success with repurposing content across several years and platforms, whether that be our website, newsletters, social media. And I'm talking about content like the poster that you see on the screen. The substance of that content, how to fight false information on WhatsApp, will not change much. It can easily be updated and be made fit for different purposes and different audiences. For example, the current version on the screen might be something we share on WhatsApp. All the information that you need is in one picture. It does not cost too much cellular data to download, and it's quick and easy for people to forward it on. On TikTok or Instagram, we may want to convert this into a video with examples and fun skits, making it more engaging and helping people to remember the key points. For our website, we may convert this into a much longer guide with extra context and information on why certain claims go viral on WhatsApp and why this can be dangerous. So in this way, we can see that we're already getting more out of this one piece of media literacy content than with a single fact check. I just have one more slide before I'll pass back over to you, Arwa, and that's on the African Fact-Checking Awards. It's the longest running awards program honoring fact-checking journalism by the media in Africa, and it's currently in its 10th year. We tend to have 3 categories, with the honors going to a winner and a runner-up. So for a fact check of the year by a working journalist, a professional fact checker, or a student journalist. And these awards are really a way to encourage and celebrate fact checks about important topics that either originated in or are relevant to Africa, where the verdict is either misleading or wrong. We've received over 300 entries this year, and this figure just keeps growing every year. And I think that by recognizing and rewarding those who work hard in the pursuit of accuracy, these awards are encouraging others to follow in their footsteps and uphold the highest standards of fact-checking. I'll leave it there for now and see if there are any questions.
شكرا لك كايلي على هذا التقديم المفصل لأفريكا تشيك. كان من الرائع رؤية الصورة يعني ما بين 2012 و2022. أنا سأذكر المشاركين معنا بأنه بإمكانهم طرح الأسئلة بخصوص هذا الويبينار على خانة ال Q&A أو تشات، وأنه أيضا يسعدنا أنه أي شيء تعلمتموه أو أي شيء لفت انتباهكم خلال هذه الجلسة أن تشاركوه كما كتبت لكم فاطمة في الشات عبر السوشيال ميديا باستخدام واسمي هاشتاج دليل وهاشتاج AFCN، وأيضا متابعة حسابات الشبكة عبر تويتر، الشبكة العربية لمدققي المعلومات عبر تويتر وإنستغرام. إلى حد الآن ليس لدينا أسئلة، ولكن أنا لدي أسئلة في الحقيقة. يعني أنت تحدثتِ عن أفريكا فاكتس نتورك، وكما قلنا صورة 2012 و2022 والعدد الذي تجاوز 50 منصة، منها منصات ناطقة باللغة العربية، يعني من شمال إفريقيا، من تونس هنالك منصات انضمت يعني إلى الشبكة، وأيضا من تسمعوني الآن؟ هل الصوت واضح؟ هل الصوت واضح الآن؟
Yes.
تمام جميل. تمام. يعني كما قلت هنالك منصات سواء من تونس أو مصر انضمت إلى الشبكة، وربما هنالك منصات أخرى في بلدان عربية أخرى إفريقية تفكر في الانضمام. هل ممكن أن تحدثينا ولو بشكل سريع عن كيف يمكن لمنصة تدقيق معلومات أن تصبح جزء من الشبكة الإفريقية لتدقيق المعلومات؟
Great, thanks, Arwa. Yes, we've had in the last few years enormous growth of the network, and it's really encouraging to see organizations from regions that we haven't yet managed to reach, like North Africa. So it's great to see some of those organizations coming on board. Insofar as becoming a member, we have a dedicated team at Africa Check that accepts applications to become a member of the network. And they take you through every step of the process and all of the requirements and the boxes that need to be ticked. So I can also share that contact information if we have fact checkers here from the North Africa region that may be interested. But yes, it's really quite a straightforward process with somebody guiding you through the steps.
عفوا المايك كان مش مفتوح. فحبيت أسألك أيضا، شكرا لك على الإجابة كايلي، ولكن حبيت أسأل سؤال آخر. أنت تحدثتي عن البري بانكينج والدي بانكينج، فسؤالي كان أي هذه الممارسات شفتي إنه هي أكثر نجاعة في السياق الإفريقي؟ هل إنه البري بانكينج يكون أو التفنيد الوقائي يكون أكثر نجاعة، أم إنه نحتاج ربما إلى تدقيق المعلومات بعد النشر أكثر؟
That's a great question. And I will touch on this in more detail later on in the presentation when I talk about the challenges of fact-checking in Africa. But in short, to answer your question, I think that fact-checking organizations, not just in Africa, but around the world, need to employ both pre-bunking and debunking. I think these are methods that complement one another. There are certainly merits to both and risks to both. And so when you do them together, I think that gives us the best shot.
هل هنالك شيء ربما مختلف على مستوى السياق الإفريقي؟ يعني وجدتوا ربما اهتمام أكثر بالبري بانكينج أو لا؟
I think the success of either pre-bunking or debunking relates to the communities that you are trying to reach. So we often talk about a big drawback of debunking being limited reach, that you're not able to get the message across to all of those who need it. But with pre-bunking, it's perhaps less resource intensive, and you are able to do things like when we spoke about the media literacy content, repurpose it into several different pieces of content, which can then be shared to a wider audience and in different contexts and different languages. So I think it really depends on who you're trying to reach and for what purpose.
نعم. أيضا هنالك سؤال آخر فيما يتعلق بالميديا ليترسي أو التربية على وسائل الإعلام التي تحدثت عنها بتفصيل، يعني على مستوى المبادرات وما تقدمه أفريكا تشيك. يعني هل ربما نحتاج، أنت أيضا تحدثتي عن الأشكال المختلفة أو الفورماتس المختلفة على حسب المنصة اللي احنا نستهدف من خلالها الجمهور، ولكن هنالك أيضا تجربة لأفريكا تشيك على مستوى تنويع الأشكال، اعتماد الأشكال الترفيهية بعض الشيء لإيصال نتائج تدقيق المعلومات. فهل يعني تعتبرين أنه علينا أن يعني نأخذ هذا الاتجاه أيضا، أنه احنا نستخدم ربما الميمز، الشورت فيديوز أو الفيديوهات القصيرة، المحتويات اللي فيها نوعا ما جانب ترفيهي في عمليات تدقيق المعلومات، خاصة ربما خلال الفترات الحرجة مثل كوفيد-19 أو غيرها؟
Yes, and it's interesting that you mentioned COVID-19. This was the first time that we actually began to experiment with TikTok and short-term videos that didn't make fun of serious situations, but used humor to appeal to the youth. And I think this content is, for the youth, perhaps more engaging than, for example, reading a fact check on our website. So we did find that to be quite successful. Another sort of form of entertainment that we experimented with was interactive radio drama in Nigeria, where we produced a fact-checking show where callers were encouraged to call in and act out certain scenarios around false information. And again, it's just a way to engage people and make fact-checking fun, because sometimes it can be a little bit boring when you say to someone, these are the facts, this is the data, this is how we arrived at our conclusion. Not everyone is interested in sitting on our website and reading 1,000-word fact check. So there are times that call for pieces of content that are more engaging.
شكرا جزيلا. هنالك سؤال من لقاء حول منهجيتكم في البحث عن المعلومات التي يمكن أن تسبب إرباكا كما تحدثت في المداخلة. أيضا ربما سؤالي يشبه ما تحدثنا عنه منذ قليل، كيف نوصل أكثر التقارير إلى الجمهور الذين يكونون أكثر عرضة ربما لهذه المحتويات؟
Yes, that's a great question, because your fact check needs to be able to appeal to a wide audience, and it can be the case that in countries or contexts where literacy levels are low, you may be excluding certain audiences. And so one of the things that we are very clear about is writing in as simple a way as possible, so that anybody reading our work, regardless of their educational background, would be able to understand our conclusions and replicate them. This is a very important part of our methodology, and I would like to touch on that a little bit, and the question around it causing confusion or bias. I think it's important that every fact check follows the exact same process. And so at Africa Check, we will follow the same steps every time. First, always reaching out to the person who made the claim and asking them for their evidence. Second, weighing that evidence up against the best available data. third speaking to experts for extra context, extra information, and then writing up the report in such a way that you name all of your sources and you link to all of your evidence, so that when somebody is reading the fact check, they don't just have to take your word for it. They can see from the steps that you have followed that or why you have come to your conclusion. And this is the process that we follow for every fact check.
جميل جدا. هنالك سؤال آخر حول ما تقدمه أفريكا تشيك من تدريبات، وأنت تحدثتي عن ذلك. هنالك من يسأل إذا كانت تقدم تدريبات لمدققي المعلومات، ويمكن أن أضيف سؤال آخر، هو هل التدريبات التي تقدمها أفريكا تشيك أو تقدمها في إطار أفريكا فاكتس نتورك، شبكة المدققين الأفارقة، هل هي فقط موجهة لمدققي المعلومات وربما الطلبة أو الناشطين من القارة الإفريقية فقط، يعني أم أنه أيضا هي متاحة لمن يريدون الاستفادة منها من خارج القارة؟
Yes, absolutely. Our training is not limited to those in the African continent, and we have trained journalists, civil society organizations, media from outside Africa.
هنالك سؤال مرتبط بالسؤال الأول الذي طرحته حول كيفية الانضمام إلى الشبكة الإفريقية. كيف تتأكدون من أن هذه المنصات غير متحيزة، ليست لديها أي انتماءات حزبية أو حكومية؟
Yeah, that's a great question. All the applications that come through are, of course, vetted and have to meet certain requirements. And one of them would definitely be around methodology and how that organization maintains its independence, whether that be editorially or financially, as well as levels of transparency around how it conducts its work.
جميل. يمكننا أن نواصل كايلي لو تحبي، ثم نأخذ باقة أخرى من الأسئلة. ولكن قبل ذلك أريد أن أذكر كما قلت بأنه يمكنكم طرح الأسئلة على خانة الQ&A أو الشات، وأيضا أذكركم بالويبينار القادم من مشروع دليل، وهو الويبينار السادس تحت عنوان كيف نتحقق من المعلومات باستخدام فيسبوك ولينكد إن، مع الباحث وعضو فريق التحقق من المنصة المعروفة طبعا بيلينغات نيثن باتن، وتدير الجلسة مستشارة الشبكة العربية لمدققي المعلومات رشا فائق، وذلك في 25 من أيلول سبتمبر من الساعة 4 إلى الساعة 6 مساء بتوقيت عمان GMT+3 طبعا. فيمكنكم يعني التجهيز لهذا الويبينار المهم وهو الويبينار السادس. ولكن الآن سنعود إلى كايلي كليفورد للحديث أكثر عن التحديات التي يمكن أن يواجهها مدققو المعلومات في القارة الإفريقية.
Thanks, Arwa. So there are a number of challenges when it comes to fact-checking in Africa, some of which I think you will also experience in the Arab region, as they are not necessarily unique to Africa, but they do require us to think creatively about how to overcome them in particular contexts. So I've tried to group them together under certain themes, and the first one that I want to discuss is government regulation. As fact checkers, I'm sure at least one person has asked you whether the solution to false information is not simply a law that penalizes its circulation. It's a logical question, but the answer, I think, is more complicated than people assume. And here I'm going to refer to research conducted recently by Peter Cunliffe-Jones, who says that in order to draw up laws to combat false information, there needs to be understanding of the types, the drivers, and the effects of misinformation and how best to counter them. We have seen policymakers in a number of African countries try to do this. In fact, in 11 African countries that were studied, such as Benin and South Africa, between 2016 and 2021, the number of false news laws almost doubled from 17 to 31. And some may describe this as a good thing, assuming that these false news laws assist in combating misinformation. But the research shows that actually the growth in these often punitive laws has had a negative effect on media and political freedom. In Uganda, for example, self-censorship has increased in the recent past due to the state's continued arbitrary application of the law. But importantly, the laws have had virtually no identifiable effect on the level of harm misinformation caused. Yes, sure. Sorry about that. So these laws, the research showed, didn't have much effect on the level of harm that misinformation causes. That's because these laws are often reactive, meaning that they punish, but they don't necessarily stop or correct the alleged misinformation. This does place more pressure on organizations such as Africa Check. We do need help from policymakers, but not in the sense that you might think. Access to reliable information is crucial to counter misinformation. And we see that this practice is growing in many countries. At least it's there in the legal framework, if it is not necessarily being practiced yet. But when it comes to legal frameworks, what we actually need to see are laws that actually enable corrective information, self-regulation of the media, and hold public officials to account. This may be more useful than punishing or trying to criminalize the sharing of false information. But this does require a huge amount of political will, the likes of which we are just not seeing. The problem is that some African countries, there are actually no laws which enforce access to information. And yet, this is a key part of our work as fact checkers. I've included this fact-checking report as an example. In 2016, our Senegal team set out to fact-check the claim that President Macky Sall had built 200 times more roads than his predecessor. It took them months to get the information that they needed to publish this report. In the end, the claim was incorrect, but one could argue that by the time we were able to prove this, the damage had already been done. Accessing information in these contexts takes extra time and therefore resources. It means, for example, that in addition to our regular work, we also have to become advocates for access to information by doing things like attending public debates on information laws and publishing commentary encouraging the publication of certain data so that we can actually verify the accuracy of claims that are being made in the public domain. But even in countries where accessing information is provided for in the legal framework, the quality of that information can make our work challenging. Because in order to assess claims made in the public domain, fact checkers need access to quality data. For example, right now in Kenya, the most recent data on maternal and child health was last collected in 2014. This was when the last Kenya Demographic and Health Survey was published. What this means is that anytime we fact-check claims around maternal and child health in that country, it is incredibly difficult, if not impossible. And we cannot contribute to more accurate public debate on this issue if the only data we have access to is already years old. We face similar challenges in South Africa, where a lack of funding for nationally representative surveys on rape, for example, make it difficult to really actually contribute to debates on gender-based violence, despite this being such a huge issue for the country. Another challenge of working across Africa relates to diversity among, but even within its countries. I think it's important to sometimes remind people that when we talk of Africa, we are talking about a continent of 54 individual countries. It's not one homogeneous entity, and we have to keep that in mind when it comes to fact-checking and its effectiveness in different contexts on the continent. So in South Africa, where I'm based, almost 80% of the population has access to the internet. That means that when we put our work on our website, we can be fairly certain that people who set out to find our work online can do so quite easily. But by comparison, in Uganda, Ethiopia, Sierra Leone, to name a few examples, the percentage of individuals accessing the internet drops to 10, 17, and 18%. In these situations, we need to find alternative means of reaching people. We have found that in communities where people are relying on more traditional forms of media to stay informed, say radio, this can be a good alternative solution. But even in countries where large amounts of the population are accessing the internet, say Botswana or Ghana or Mauritius, there are still barriers that make the digital experience less enabling for Africans. There may be things like limited digital literacy skills to navigate the online landscape. And this leaves some communities vulnerable to what you or I might immediately recognize as a scam or a manipulated photo or unrelated health advice. It's why we have placed such emphasis on media literacy rather than knocking back individual instances of false information as and when we see them. Similarly, while people may have access to the internet, they may not know where to go to find information they can trust. We saw this particularly during COVID-19, when people felt totally overwhelmed by the information they were receiving, and they weren't sure which information they could trust and which information they couldn't. Poor regulation of online spaces complicates this, because where disinformation circulates, whether it be through a coordinated campaign or otherwise, the waters are muddied and people don't know where to turn. In countries where government agencies don't make information easily available online, digitally illiterate communities are again vulnerable. Language is another barrier here, because even though only about 19% of the world speaks English as a first or a second language, English accounts for 61% of content online. This shows us that accurate information not only needs to reach more people, but it needs to be in a language that they understand. And with over 1,000 languages spoken on the continent, investment in translation is a must. Apart from the digital and language divide, there are ethnic, cultural, and religious differences that are sometimes exploited for political mobilization on the continent. This in turn leads to hyper-partisan debate in which it becomes difficult to have a conversation about the facts. We see this, for example, in South Africa when it comes to conversations around migration and xenophobia, because there are some valid concerns around the porosity of the country's borders, but claims that the country is being overrun by foreigners who then contribute to high unemployment and crime figures are just not supported by the available data. But when the debate around this issue is so partisan and fueled by narratives that are shared by politicians, it becomes difficult to convince people of this, even when you set out all of the facts step by step. To me, this suggests that even when you follow a fact-checking methodology based on transparency, it may not be enough to convince people. And so the question is, do we cut our losses and accept that we will never change people's minds on issues like this? Or do we try a different approach? And what would that look like? This is a question that we are still trying to answer. I mentioned earlier that one of our main organizational goals is to foster a culture of fact-checking across the continent. And I demonstrated some of the projects and initiatives we've embarked upon to achieve this goal. But there are particular challenges in this area as well, because while fact-checking has always existed as part of the reporting process, and for some time now, fact-checking organizations have existed independently of that process in other parts of the world. In Africa, and I'm sure you may experience this in the Arab region as well, fact-checking is not a widely understood concept. Not everyone knows what fact-checking is or why it's important. It means that when we are starting a fact check, we pick up the phone or send an email to find out the source. We can't just stop at, my name is Kaylee Clifford and I'm a researcher at Africa Check. We have to go further and explain what Africa Check does, what fact-checking is. And even when you take the time to do that, there's a high likelihood that you may not be taken seriously. Fostering a culture of fact-checking also means challenging people's mindsets. When Africa Check's founder, Peter Cunliffe-Jones, first floated the idea of an African fact-checking organization, some people told him that it would never work because there are no facts in Africa. We know that this is not the case. Of course, we face challenges with access to data, but fact-checking on the continent is possible. Related to this is encouraging accountability. Because even if people accept fact-checking as a practice and they know what it is, they are not always convinced of their responsibility to take accountability when they share false information. This is particularly the case with public office bearers and members of government. But fostering a culture of fact-checking is not only a challenge with politicians. It can sometimes be a challenge with journalists and media houses. We often have to remind professionals in the industry that it's not enough to simply report what someone has said. You have to go further and check whether what they said was accurate. In addition to he said, she said reporting, we have also seen in recent years a loss of trust in information providers. We've seen this fake news, mainstream media narrative promoted by certain people, and that extends to fact-checking. It has resulted in a fair amount of suspicion of fact-checkers and the work that they do, even where organizations are operating with transparency. Lastly, fostering a culture of fact-checking requires advocating for corrections. So at Africa Check, we encourage politicians, the media, and other organizations to be more transparent about false or misleading claims that they may have made, and to either correct or withdraw these claims from public circulation. We think that this is an effective tool for underpinning accountability and transparency. And this is really key if we want to build and sustain the public's trust. But it can be difficult to convince people of this. All of this brings us to a final challenge, perhaps the biggest of them all, that fact-checking alone is not enough. And this is not specific to Africa. I think it's a lesson that fact-checking organizations around the world have had to learn. I want to preface this by saying that there are some clear benefits to simply publishing a fact check. And we have seen this both from experience, but it is also evident in the research. And the first benefit is to the audience that the fact check does reach, the audience that is informed, and if a person held an incorrect belief, they are corrected most of the time. And this audience is often larger and broader than you might think. We have search engines which help fact checks reach people who wouldn't be regular readers. And now with social media platforms coming on board and waking up to the dangers of mis and disinformation, I'm thinking here, for example, of Meta and its third-party fact-checking program. Correct information and fact checks are surfaced directly in front of social media users. Second, when the fact checker is known and trusted as fair, they can, over time, build influential audiences. So other journalists and policymakers may use their work, and in that way, they can help to inform debate, even when their work is not seen directly by everyone that it affects. Another benefit of publishing fact checks is to the wider public. It's what we sometimes call the "they know we check" effect. So we see individuals and institutions being surprised when we reach out to them and we ask them for the evidence for what they have said. And we see governments making changes to avoid being vulnerable to fact checkers. For example, in South Africa, we have noticed a trend whereby national addresses by the president have become more and more forward-looking. And when specific facts and figures are mentioned, a majority of them are correct. It may be difficult to prove that this is a direct result of the fact-checking that we have done in that country. It could just mean that speechwriters are carefully picking the facts that they want to share. But it makes sense that if a government knows somebody is listening and checking, they are likely to be more cautious about what they say. So fact-checking can absolutely work, but not if that is all we do. Because despite its inherent value in correcting the public record and providing additional context around a specific topic, the idea that fact-checking can work by correcting the public's inaccurate beliefs on a mass scale doesn't quite add up. It's not really surprising when, despite our best efforts, and despite the fact that we publish a lot of fact checks, people still believe inaccurate things and politicians still distort the facts. There are some major constraints to this method, sometimes called the publish and pray method. One is reach. So we've touched on this briefly, but we know that we are not getting messages through to all of those that need them. And there's no realistic prospect of anyone funding the communications effort that it would take to get that reach. A second and possibly bigger challenge relates to how people process information and how that process is not always rational. We've previously used the example of walking late into a party where people have been arguing about politics and you announce that you have a doctorate in what they're talking about and you start to correct everyone there. That kind of scenario does not go down very well. The most effective campaigns of persuasion engage people's emotions and not just their heads. So the first generation of fact-checking organizations tried fact-checking with only this model of pure journalism, and some are still doing this. While the benefits are real, they are not enough. I do think that first generation fact-checking has a place as part of a wider set of tactics in a fact-checking organization, or as part of the offer of major media outlets that can include fact-checking accountability in their everyday work. And this is, in a sense, where it has always belonged, at the heart of good journalism. And independent fact-checkers can take some credit for inspiring a renewal of interest in fact-checking in the mainstream media. But some fact-checkers have already moved on. They have learned from experience and come up with more effective models for tackling mis and disinformation. This is sometimes called second generation fact-checking. And second generation fact-checkers do more than publishing fact checks. They focus not just on who they are reaching, but what they can change and how to hold people accountable. What this looks like is different when you look at different country contexts. It needs creativity and a sensitive understanding of the political environment and the media environment to understand what is possible. But much of the logic is the same, even in different countries. So first, there's a move from just publishing to publishing and acting, doing things like seeking corrections on the record, pressuring people not to make the same false claim again, and where possible, complaining to a standards body. In other words, using whatever forms of pressure there are available to stop the spread of specific misinformation. But fact-checking also provides a unique evidence space. It gives us important insight into where misleading claims come from and how they are spread. And this is work that fact-checkers do. They really understand the problems of mis and disinformation in a way that nobody else does. And we can use this to our advantage by turning it into decision-ready information that can inform our work, perhaps others in civil society, perhaps tech platforms, basically anyone with the power to act, to tackle false information. Using this evidence, we are also able to identify patterns and common causes. And here is where we can intervene to reduce particular kinds or sources of information. So this could be, for example, a pattern in who is publishing something or where it is published. Maybe it's a particular subject that there is a lot of false information about. Once you have that evidence, you can intervene and do things like educating children all the way to advocating for policy change. So there's a lot of room to grow, but I think one thing that is clear is that fact checkers can't afford to stay stuck in this first generation model. We can already see that even second generation approaches are no longer enough. There's even a third generation of fact-checking, which will have to address not only these issues that we've discussed today, but they also need to be able to work at internet scale, be massively collaborative, and work across international borders. And we are already seeing some of the early work that is getting us closer to that. I'll leave it there now, Arwa, and see if there are any questions.
شكرا جزيلا كايلي. أعتقد أنه الكثير من الصعوبات والتحديات التي تحدثت عنها يعني نتشاركها أيضا في العالم العربي وليس في أفريقيا فقط. لدينا أسئلة تخص الكثير من الأسئلة تخص بالفعل شبكة أفريكا فاكتس نتورك، شبكة مدققي المعلومات في أفريقيا. ولكن قبل ذلك هنالك أيضا من يطلب منا الإيميل، عنوان بريد إلكتروني يمكن من خلاله إرسال طلبات الانضمام إلى الشبكة. فممكن أن تشاركيه معنا كايلي إذا ممكن أو في وقت لاحق يعني. وأذكر هنا كل المشاركين معنا أنه يمكنهم الحصول على المواد التي قدمتها كايلي، كل العرض الذي قدمته بمجرد تعبئة استمارة تقييم الجلسة يصلكم كل المواد الموجودة. وإذا لم يكن لديك الإيميل الآن كايلي، أيضا يمكن أن نرسل الإيميل مع المواد التعليمية بمجرد تعبئة استمارة تقييم الجلسة. ولكن ربما تبي هو الشخص الذي يجب التواصل معه في هذا الخصوص، صحيح؟
Yes, that's exactly right, Arwa, and I will post Tipe's email address in the chat box.
جميل. جميل. تمام. إذا كايلي ستشارك معنا إيميل تبي، وهو الشخص الذي يمكن أن نراسله في حين إذا كنا نريد أن ننضم إلى أفريكا فاكتس نتورك. هنالك الكثير من التعليقات التي تشكرك على هذا العرض كايلي، وكما قلت أسئلة متعلقة خاصة بشبكة أفريقيا تشيك، وأيضا بالجوائز التي تقدمها أفريقيا تشيك فيما يتعلق بأفضل تقارير تدقيق المعلومات. سأطرح هذه الأسئلة عليك بعد قليل، ولكن لدي سؤال فيما يخص التحديات. يعني مثلا من بين التحديات الكبرى التي ذكرتها والتي يواجهها مدققو المعلومات في العالم العربي أيضا هي النفاذ إلى المعلومات والبيانات. هل تعتبرين أنه من بين الحلول يمكن أن، طبعا هذا سيمثل جهد وعبء إضافي على مدققي المعلومات، ولكن أن يعملوا أيضا على إطلاق قواعد بيانات مثلا مثل ما فعلت أريج والشبكة العربية لمدققي المعلومات بإطلاق قاعدة بيانات حول حوادث الطرقات، وكان عمل مضني يعني في جمع هذه البيانات في 4 بلدان عربية. ولكن هل ترين أنه هذا الأمر أيضا يمكن أن يساعد بقية المدققي المعلومات، أنه إلى جانب تدقيق المعلومات سيكون علينا أيضا العمل والاجتهاد في توفير البيانات والمعلومات؟
Yes, thanks, Arwa. That's a great question because access to data can really limit the types of claims that you can fact check. A lot of the time when we come up against this challenge, we will fact check the claim as far as possible, and we will share with our readers what we do know. And maybe this is in the form of a blog, or maybe it's in the form of a fact sheet, but it is still important to share what information there is available and acknowledge that some claims cannot be fact-checked for lack of data. But I also think that this is an area in which there is room for fact-checking organizations to advocate. Typically, we don't see ourselves as advocacy organizations because that sometimes requires taking a stance or having an opinion on something. But in the area of access to data, and this being so crucial to the work that we do, we have often, for example, published blog pieces encouraging access to quality data. Another thing that we have found useful in the absence of quality local data is international databases, such as those kept by the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund. While these often have incomplete data for regions in Africa, and I suspect probably countries in the Arab region as well, it can offer some help. The other thing that we often do is speak to experts in the absence of data, because while numbers and figures are certainly important, you can also get relevant information that is still useful and still applicable to the claim that you are trying to fact check from an expert. They have been working in the field, they have experience on that topic, and so they may even be able to point you in the direction of a data set that you didn't know existed. And so I would definitely recommend trying to get in touch with an expert for those kinds of claims.
صحيح، يعني الاستعانة بالخبراء خاصة في مواضيع دقيقة التخصص ربما. هنالك سؤال آخر أعتقد أنه هو مرتبط ارتباط وثيق بالتحديات التي تواجهها مؤسسة تدقيق المعلومات حول الأزمات. تعرفين أنه في القارة الإفريقية أو في العالم العربي يعني لا الأزمات هي الشيء الحمد لله لدينا يعني بغزارة، فللأسف الشديد يكون علينا التعامل مع أزمات أحيانا قصيرة المدى طويلة المدى. هنالك سؤال أنه في ظل مختلف هذه الأزمات التي تعيشها القارة الإفريقية، ربما الأحداث الأخيرة في الغابون والنيجر والسودان وغيرها، هنا ربما سيبرز أكثر دور تدقيق المعلومات في وقت الأزمات. كيف تتعاملون مع الأزمات في أفريقيا تشيك؟ هل تضعون استراتيجيات ربما خاصة في وقت الأزمة التي قد تستوجب أسرع، ربما عملية التدقيق أن تكون أسرع من الأوقات العادية وفيها أيضا تحديات خاصة خلال هذه الأحداث؟
That certainly is a challenge. And I mentioned earlier that we are quite fortunate in the sense that in the countries we operate in, South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, and Senegal, we have not necessarily been in a situation where we've been unable to do our fact-checking work. These are countries where there is decent levels of media freedom, and we can carry out our work without too much risk. But I think that in countries where crises are being experienced and where media freedom is being restricted, it can be possible to navigate those environments while still adhering to fact-checking standards. And I say this because it can be tempting when we're rushing in times of crisis to skip certain steps, to rush to be the first to say that a certain claim is right or wrong. But we do have to uphold standards even during times of crisis. I think one other thing that becomes important is things like secure communications. This is particularly in countries where certain platforms are restricted. Having good digital security and a way to communicate will be important. And then, of course, safety measures. Safety must come first.
أكيد كما ذكرتِ كايلي، هنالك تحدي الموازنة ما بين السرعة والدقة. هنالك سؤال آخر أيضًا يتعلق بتحدٍ آخر، وهو المحتويات التي يولدها الذكاء الاصطناعي. أنا كنت قرأت تقرير لأفريقيا تشيك تتحدث عن إنه غالبية المحتويات التي تنتشر حاليًا ما زالت يعني على السوشيال ميديا، على الميديا الاجتماعية بشكل عام، هي تنتمي لما يسمى تزييف منخفض التكلفة أو الcheap fake، مقارنة بالديب فيك أو مقارنة بالمحتويات التي ينتجها الذكاء الاصطناعي. هنالك سؤال هنا عن الأدوات التي تستخدمونها تجاه هذه المحتويات، وأيضا كيف تتعاملون بشكل عام يعني مع أي محتويات يمكن أن تكون مولدة بالذكاء الاصطناعي.
Thanks, Arwa. That's a really interesting question because we have seen in the last couple of months an increasing panic about AI-generated content, whether it be images or videos, and a fear, which is rational, that our information environment will become very difficult for regular social media users, people accessing the internet, to differentiate between content that is real and content that has been AI generated. What is interesting is that in our context, the bulk of what we fact check, as you mentioned, is still actually good old-fashioned forms of trickery. So images that have been taken out of context, meaning that they are real. They have not been digitally manipulated in any way, but they claim to show something that actually didn't happen, or claim to show something that actually happened years ago. So for now, and of course, this is changing rapidly, but our focus is still on fact-checking those kinds of claims and teaching people or giving people the skills that they need to fact-check those kinds of claims, rather than on AI-generated content. That said, we have seen one or two examples of this kind of content, but in most cases, they have not been too difficult to debunk. I think the kind of sophisticated AI-generated content that we sometimes see in the Americas or in Europe has not quite become a problem in the African context yet.
نعم. شكرا كايلي. هنالك نقطة تحدثتِ أنتِ عنها في البداية، عندما نقرر متى نقرر إنه هذه التقارير التدقيق التي قمنا بها لا ننشرها أو ننشرها. هنالك سؤال بهذا الخصوص من ميسم. هل تعتبرين أنه يجب ترك التقارير التدقيق أو عمليات التحقق التي قمنا بها ولا ننشرها إذا كان مضرة بالمجتمع، إذا كانت ستكون ضارة بالمجتمع؟ وربما أيضا أريد أن أضيف سؤال هنا، كيف سنحدد ذلك؟ يعني هل هنالك معايير معينة تجعلنا قادرين على أن نحدد أنه هذا فعلا ضرر النشر يفوق ضرر التدقيق في حد ذاته؟
There is always a risk when you fact check a claim that by focusing on it and by publishing a fact check, you are increasing its reach more than you would if you had just left it alone to begin with. And so if the challenge is deciding what to fact check and what is worth fact checking, reach is something you do want to consider. How many people has this false claim reached? And if you didn't fact check it, what harm would come from it? If the answer to those questions is it has had a very wide reach and left unchecked, it may lead to potential harm, then absolutely it is worth fact-checking. And there is evidence to show that fact-checking in this way is effective. Where it can sometimes be unhelpful is if you are taking a claim that maybe hasn't seen that wide of a reach, or maybe it hasn't been made by a prominent politician or a public office bearer, and you amplify it and you give it more air than it would have had if you had just left it.
نعم، شكرا لك. إذا كايلي يمكن أن نتابع القسم الأخير من العرض، وأذكر أنه لكل من يريد الحصول على المادة التعليمية نرجو منكم تعبئة استمارة تقييم الجلسة اللي هي مفيدة فقط ليس للحصول على المادة التعليمية فقط، ولكن أيضا مفيدة للشبكة حتى تقيم جلساتها. ونطلب منكم أن تشاركوا كل المعلومات التي وجدتموها مفيدة عبر وسمي هاشتاج دليل وهاشتاج AFCN. إليك إذا كايلي لنكمل القسم الأخير من الجلسة.
Great, thank you. So picking up from where I left off, if fact-checking alone is not enough, collaboration with key stakeholders has to become a cornerstone of our work. At Africa Check, we really enjoy it when people share our work, and we actively seek out partners to help us reach new and diverse audiences. In the next few slides, I'm going to highlight a few initiatives that have helped us to scale our work. For example, in 2021, we launched a media literacy campaign to empower the youth to critically engage with online information and question health claims about COVID-19 and vaccines. You will all know that during the COVID-19 pandemic, an overabundance of information, some of it correct and some of it not, made it difficult for people to know where to turn. As fact checkers, we could not have possibly addressed each piece of misinformation we saw. So starting just with the countries that we have offices in, the goal of the campaign was to improve the quality of public debate and encourage evidence-based decision-making. So this was the series that helped the public to learn more about COVID-19 and how to understand and use healthcare information. It also explained the different vaccines, so how they were developed and how they work. The series included videos, podcast episodes, and graphics in several languages, including English, Hausa, Kiswahili, Pidgin, Wolof, and isiZulu. Even so, and realizing the limits of our reach, we partnered with key public health, youth, and education-focused organizations to try and increase the reach of the content. With the success of the project in these countries, Africa Check expanded it to 5 other countries: the Democratic Republic of Congo, Eswatini, Zambia, Namibia, and Zimbabwe. But because we don't typically work in these countries, it was important that we had an understanding of the local context. So again, we partnered with local organizations, many of them members of the Africa Facts Network. So Congo Check in the DRC, Eswatini Media Monitoring and Research, MISA Zambia, Namibia Fact Check, and ZimFact in Zimbabwe. We were specifically targeting local language speakers who were digitally underconnected. And so by partnering with the 5 organizations, we were able to design country and context-specific media literacy and translate it into widely spoken local languages. Each organization then partnered with at least 1 media outlet and 1 civil society organization to reach both digitally connected and unconnected communities. The project also led to other opportunities for collaboration. So, for example, the organization we partnered with in Zambia was able to link its campaign with one run by the government's health ministry. This in turn increased people's access to accurate information about COVID vaccines, especially in remote and rural communities. We also have to get more comfortable collaborating with tech platforms. We encourage social media platforms to play their part in the fight against false information, and this includes collaborating with them where possible. I mentioned earlier that Africa Check is a third-party fact-checking partner of Meta, and this allows us to fact-check claims that are flagged as potentially false on Facebook. This is work that we are paid to do, but this can sometimes be controversial. So sometimes people say to us, well, social media platforms are the biggest culprits in the spread of false information. And if you take money from people like Facebook and Google, why should we trust you? Here, I think the fact that false information is prevalent on social media and on platforms is a consequence of the times. It is helpful if these platforms collaborate with fact checkers to ensure that they amplify accurate information and reduce the spread of false information. What is unhelpful is defining the relationship between fact checkers and platforms as one driven purely by interests. I think this downplays the social responsibility goals that both parties play in democracies around the world. Platforms have the tools, they have the reach, they have the resources. Fact checkers have the skills, they have the knowledge and the patience to do fact checking. And by working together transparently, that's very important, we are elevating the quality of public debate. And the public is always free to gauge the fact checks based on the evidence or the proof. Of course, there's always more work to be done with regard to media and digital literacy and the safety of platform users, but we have to start from somewhere. During elections, this kind of collaboration becomes more important than ever. In the run-up to Kenya's 2022 election, we partnered with Meta and Twitter, or X as it is now known, to fight election-related misinformation. On Facebook, when our Kenyan fact checkers reviewed content in English or Kiswahili and rated it as false, Meta would reduce its distribution and add a warning label with additional information. On Twitter, it was agreed that fact-checked information would be amplified on users' feeds. Twitter also assisted with verifying the accounts of people of public interest, including some of our own researchers. This made it easier for people to identify whether they were dealing with legitimate or imposter content. Of course, a lot of this work has now been undone, unfortunately, with the changes at Twitter, meaning that a verification badge is no longer an indication of someone's credibility or authenticity. I touched earlier on the youth, but I think it's worth repeating that any efforts at creating informed media consumers need to proactively target the youth. Many young people are already accessing the internet. They already have mobile devices, and they therefore need skills to critically assess if information they receive can be trusted and can be shared. But a 2020 study that looked at media literacy in public school curricula in 7 sub-Saharan countries showed that except one program launched in one province in South Africa, there was very little specific focus on misinformation in schools. The research made it clear that simply teaching learners media literacy, which typically involves reading of media texts, understanding the relationship between the media and audiences, and knowing how media production works, is not enough in today's online environment. we actually need to see misinformation literacy. And this is a way to teach students the critical and technical skills that they need to counter the spread of misinformation online. This is what we need to be seen to teach in schools. So based on this and input from several education experts, Africa Check created fact-checking resources and training materials that high school educators can use in the classroom to teach misinformation literacy. We also ran a series of online train-the-trainer programs for high school educators. This gave them the knowledge to equip learners with the critical thinking skills that they need to recognize and stop the spread of misinformation. This past month, we also hosted a series of online discussions with education stakeholders, including representatives from provincial departments of education, organizations working in the education space, and interested high school principals. We showed them the resources that we had put together and are looking into ways to make them available to as many educators as possible. This included the launch of an educators hub on our website where teachers can access lesson plans for students from grade 8 to grade 11 on various fact-checking and media literacy topics across different themes for free. At the moment, the resources are limited to South Africa, but the plans have the potential to be adopted for other country contexts as well. In the last example of collaboration, I wanted to talk a bit about collaborating during elections. Earlier this year, Nigeria went to the polls, and it was a unique election in that we had over 90 million people that were eligible to cast their vote. There were over 180,000 polling stations in 36 states, all voting for 18 presidential candidates. And this came at a time when trust in the electoral system was really under threat. We have seen from fact-checking elections in Africa before that false and misleading claims can spread rapidly during election season, and this really undermines voters' ability to make informed choices. But fact-checking an election at this scale, we knew was not going to be an easy task. To meet the challenge, Nigerian fact-checking organizations, NGOs, and media houses came together to form the Nigerian Fact Checkers Coalition. One of its first exercises was to write an open letter to politicians during campaign season. The 8 members of the coalition appealed to political figures to avoid making false claims and to debunk false or misleading information related to their parties or their candidacies. In the letter, they mentioned the fact that mis and disinformation negatively affects the integrity of elections and can even sometimes lead to violence. They also mentioned that there had been cases of social media influencers and citizens being paid to spread false and misleading narratives. So the letter was a good way to call to attention ahead of the election some of the tactics that the public may see during campaign season. But it also let public figures know that there were people watching and ready to hold them to account. Next, the group hosted politicians, security agents, independent electoral bodies, and civil society groups at a conference to discuss the impact of falsehoods. Together, the members of the coalition kept an eye out for claims that needed a second look and shared them with the group so that they could be tackled as a collective. They held weekly meetings to stay updated and cross-published fact checks on their various platforms in order to reach a wider audience. This approach was particularly useful when it came to fact-checking debates live. Live fact-checking is something that Africa Check hadn't really experimented with before. It's something that takes a lot of planning and resources, but by combining their efforts, members of the coalition were able to quickly counter false information as it was being shared. One of the ways that they were able to do this was through the use of AI tools. In partnership with FullFact, a UK-based fact-checking organization that has been developing AI fact-checking technology since 2015 to help increase the speed, the scale, and the impact of fact-checking, we were able to facilitate access to AI tools for 23 Nigerian fact-checkers. On an average day, the tool would present thousands of fact-checkable claims to users from over 80 media sources. And these you could then filter using a sophisticated search function, using keywords, claim types, speakers. During the election, 25 claims were identified and assessed by the fact-checking teams in this way, and it saved them time, money, and effort in identifying the most important misinformation to address. In addition to the search functions, fact-checkers had access to alerts, which informed them when something that they know is false, because they had fact-checked it before, was repeated. And this allowed them to act quickly and insert accurate information into the public debate, squashing the false information. We also had the opportunity to experiment with real-time instant transcriptions of election debates, interviews, and town halls. You will all know that when you have to listen to a speech, you have to allocate team members, transcribe the claims. It can take hours, but this tool provided an accurate record of what was said, even which claims were fact-checkable, and if any claim had been fact-checked before. Of course, we know that no election is the same, and so the success of the coalition provided valuable lessons, which we may not be able to implement everywhere, but we will definitely carry these lessons with us, especially as we look to fact-check South Africa's 2024 election. So I'm at my last slide, and I thought that as Africa Check celebrated its 10th birthday last year, it would be appropriate to end my presentation with 10 lessons or takeaways. The first is that local context is king. There is no one-size-fits-all approach. We need to pay special attention to local context if our work is to be effective. Number 2, actively seek out partners. Fact checkers cannot win the fight against mis and disinformation alone. We need other stakeholders to come on board, and we need to actively engage them and encourage them to do so. Number 3, invest in pre-bunking. Fact checkers cannot be everywhere at once. A more sustainable approach lies in inoculating the public against false information before it goes viral. 4, experiment, innovate, and adapt. Not every project will be a raging success, but we need to be flexible in our approach and willing to adapt. Number 5, connect with your audience wherever they are. We really enjoy receiving claims, tip-offs, and feedback from our readers, and we let that guide our focus. It's important for them to feel involved in the process, so we carve out time to build those relationships, whether it's through social media, radio, our weekly newsletter, or quizzes and puzzles that involve our audience. Speaking of radio, in the African context, this is a medium that should not be underestimated. It's a great way to reach audiences that are otherwise digitally underconnected. 7, and we've spoken about this at length, that media literacy has the best returns. It allows you to create evergreen content that can be repurposed and shared long after a fact check on a single claim has lost its relevance. Number 8, leverage relationships to fight disinformation. Whether it be with tech, civil society, or other media organizations, take the time to build and maintain relationships. This makes collaboration easier. Number 9, indigenize fact-checking so that it appeals to the local context or culture. And lastly, number 10, employ a 360-degree approach that includes not just fact-checking, but media and digital literacy, pre-bunking, the use of AI to scale your work, capacity building, and to an extent, even advocacy. And this together will help create a safer information ecosystem.
شكرا جزيلا كايلي. ما زالت لدينا بعض الأسئلة بخصوص خاصة الفرص والتدريبات التي تمنحها أفريقيا تشيك. إذا كان هنالك من يريد أن يتدخل معنا صوتيا يطرح سؤاله يعني مباشرة إلى كايلي، يمكنكم القيام بذلك برفع اليد. إلى حين أن يكون هنالك معنا متدخل، أنا أعجبتني جدا فكرة المقاربة 360 درجة. أعتقد أنه إحنا نحتاجها بشكل كبير في عملنا، أنه لا نركز على جزء فقط، يجب أن تكون لدينا فعلا وجهة نظر واسعة يعني للتحديات التي نواجهها. وفي هذا السياق هنالك سؤال يتعلق بعملنا في تدقيق المعلومات كما ذكرت خلال مثلا فترة الانتخابات أو في سياقات سياسية ربما خاصة. قد يتعرض المدقق إلى هجمات يعني من أو يتهم بأنه هو ما يقوم به هو أيضا تضليل. كيف يمكن أن يتعامل مع ذلك خاصة إذا أتى هذا الأمر من جهات سياسية وخاصة خلال الفترات الانتخابية؟
Sorry, Arwa, I'm not sure if I heard you correctly. I just want to make sure the question is about fact-checking incorrect claims by politicians repeatedly when they keep on making the same incorrect claim.
عن الهجمات التي يمكن أن يتعرض لها المدققون والصحفيون إذا قاموا بتدقيق معلومات حول المضامين السياسية يعني خلال الفترات الانتخابية. كيف يكون عليهم التعامل مع هذه الهجمات؟ هل السؤال واضح كايلي الآن؟
Yes. Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
This can definitely be a challenge, and I mentioned earlier that part of fostering a culture of fact-checking across the continent is challenging this idea that there are no such thing as facts, or that we're trying to encourage politicians especially to take accountability for incorrect claims. I'm not sure if this is the case in the Arab region, but in Africa, respect for elders is also heavily encouraged. And so it can be difficult for especially young fact checkers to confront older members of government and do things like ask for evidence for claims that were made. It can be intimidating. It can be viewed as even disrespectful. But here, I think having a very clear and transparent fact-checking methodology helps. When you can explain what you are trying to do and how you are going to go about it, it shouldn't leave much room for people to be upset about what you are doing. We sometimes say that it's not what you say, but how you say it. And I think another thing that is important to emphasize to people when it comes to fact-checking, and especially fact-checking politicians or people in government, is we are not necessarily trying to catch anyone out. We are not trying to expose someone as being a liar. We are simply trying to provide accurate information on key topics to the public. And I think when you frame it like that, there's little room for suspicion or doubt as to what your intentions are.
هنالك سؤال حول الأدوات. هل يمكن مثلا أن تشاركي مع المتابعين اليوم صفحة الموارد التي تعتمدها أو الأدوات التي تعتمدها أفريكا تشيك، إن كان هنالك دليل ربما للأدوات التي تستخدمها، فيرغب يعني المشاركين معنا اليوم أن تشاركي معهم هذه الأدوات إن كان ذلك ممكنا.
Sure. So when it comes to the AI tools, we are very fortunate to have access to them through our partnership with FullFact. So it was a result of a fund, an award that we won together with 2 other fact-checking organizations to develop AI tools. And so as a result, we have access to them, but they are not publicly available for all fact-checking organizations yet. The hope is that these kinds of AI tools will become available because there is definitely potential to make the work of fact-checkers easier and faster. As for other tools besides AI, there are a number of guides on our website around the different tools that we use, which I'm happy to post in the chat box. I can share the links. But another thing that I like to tell people when they ask about tools is while they are important, there is no one tool that can do your fact checking for you or make your job so incredibly easy. And I don't think that tools are a substitute for the basic tenets and the basic standards of fact checking. That's also because tools change all the time. They're developed rapidly, and something that works today doesn't necessarily work tomorrow. And so while tools are, of course, important and they can help us, I think the bulk of our work is still just the basic steps of fact-checking.
سؤال أخير. شكرا. سؤال أخير كايلي لأن الوقت تقريبا انتهى، بخصوص كل التدريبات والموارد التي تتيحها أفريكا تشيك. هناك من يسأل إن كان هناك تدريبات في ليبيا، إن كانت هناك تدريبات في هذا البلد أو ذاك، أين يمكن أن يجدوا كل هذه الموارد؟
Okay, so we have all of our information on training upcoming on our website as well as on social media. So if you keep an eye on Twitter, for example, you'll find that information there. But we also do engage with organizations one-on-one if they have specific training requirements or training needs, like, for example, how to fact check during an election. And what I will do is post the email address for our training department in the chat box for organizations that would like to get in touch about specific training needs.
شكرا جزيلا لك كايلي على هذه الجلسة المفيدة التي كان فيها نقاش جد شيق حول تدقيق المعلومات في إفريقيا. أدعوكم مرة أخرى لتعبئة استمارة تقييم الجلسة للحصول على المادة التعليمية، وأيضا لحضور الويبينار السادس من مشروع دليل تحت عنوان كيف نتحقق من المعلومات باستخدام فيسبوك ولينكد إن، مع الباحث وعضو فريق التحقق في منصة بيلينغات نيثان باتن. وتدير الجلسة مستشارة الشبكة العربية لمدققي المعلومات رشا فائق، وذلك في 25 من أيلول سبتمبر على الساعة 4 مساء بتوقيت عمان إلى الساعة 6. شكرا لكم على متابعتنا اليوم، وإن شاء الله كان الويبينار مفيدا، ونلقاكم في الويبينار السادس. شكرا.